Donald Trump says he has considered halting ceasefire talks between Russia and Ukraine if there's no prospect of peace in sight. He also said he still believes there is a good chance to end the conflict. His mixed signals followed conflicting messages from his top diplomat, Marco Rubio, and his Vice President, J.D. Vance. Earlier on Friday, Mr. Rubio warned that the US may move on from trying to secure a Russia-Ukraine peace deal if there's no progress in the coming days. Well, Mr. Vance said he was optimistic about a deal. Well, we'll hear first from the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and then from Vice President Vance.
Very soon, and I'm talking about a matter of days, not a matter of weeks, whether or not this is the war that can be ended. If it can, we're prepared to do whatever we can to facilitate that and make sure that it happens, that it ends in a durable and just way. If it's not possible, if we're so far apart that this is not going to happen, then I think the president's probably at a point where he's going to say, well, we're done.
We have a couple of important issues to discuss today. I want to update the Prime Minister on some of the negotiations between Russia, Ukraine, and also some of the things that have happened. Even in the past 24 hours, we think we have some interesting things to report on, of course, in private. So these negotiations, I won't prejudge them, but we do feel optimistic that we can hopefully bring this war, this very brutal war, to a close.
Let's talk this through with our correspondents, Benjamin Alvarez Gruber in Washington, Nimisha Jaiswal in Ukraine, and Seema Gupta in Rome. Welcome all. Let's start in Washington with you, Ben. Is the situation any clearer now that President Trump appears to be backing both men?
Not really, and it shows also how remarkable this mixed messaging is, that you have two members, really high-ranking officials, the Secretary of State and the Vice President of the United States, saying things that are completely different, and then everyone waits for President Trump, and he says Marco is right, but at the same time not distancing himself, and that shows how difficult it is, not just on the war in Ukraine or on tariffs or all the other negotiations, nuclear program, for example, in Iran, where you have so many high-ranking officials with different options, basically, and it's pretty hard for others to say, okay, what's the line that the United States is actually taking in trying to advance the goal of ending the war in Ukraine?
So Seema Gupta in Rome, the Vice President's optimistic comments on Ukraine came ahead of his meeting with Giorgia Meloni, who met President Trump just the day before. What have we learned of that Rome meeting?
Well, they met, and then that was followed by a lunch meeting together with the two deputy prime ministers here in Italy. And we had a note from Palazzo Chigi, the prime minister's office, after their meeting, essentially saying that they offered to discuss further the current international political situation, and in particular efforts to bring a just and lasting peace to Ukraine. So clearly that was a key subject discussed, along with bilateral ties between Italy and the US. But the Vice President seemed very clear in his comments before his meeting that he was optimistic that the US would be able to put an end to the war. He said that he wanted to discuss what happened, in fact, even in the last 24 hours in terms of the negotiations. He said he didn't want to prejudge them, but that he was optimistic that they could bring about an end to this brutal war. So clearly a very optimistic stance from the Vice President, but something quite different we're hearing from the Secretary of State.
Nimisha Jaiswal in Ukraine, regardless of the Vice President's optimism, none of this confusion can be good for Ukraine.
Definitely, Phil, what Marco Rubio said and what Trump backed up has confirmed the fears here that Trump may lose interest when he realizes that this is not the easy win he was hoping for when he first said he could end the war in a day, then later in a few weeks, in 100 days. We've heard different iterations, but it's not been an easy problem to solve. Now, of course, over here, Kyiv would remind the US, as it has over the last weeks, that it agreed to an unconditional ceasefire over a month ago, that Russia is the one dragging its feet, that Russia is the one continuing to target civilians here. But of course, another key complaint here is that Russia does not face similar pressure as Ukraine does. Now, of course, this comment by Marco Rubio could be seen as a tactic to lay pressure on both sides. But one of the main worries that Ukraine will have is if the US does walk away, will it walk away with its military and intelligence support? We saw the damage that did. Now, there was a poll held here last month, and most Ukrainians, over 80%, believe that even if the US withdraws support, they should continue struggling for a just peace with European support. How realistic that would be to immediately replace the immense impact of US military and intelligence there is, of course, a much harder question to answer.
Well, let's pick up that question with Ben in Washington. We're all guessing now, Ben, I guess, what America walking away from talks might look like.
Exactly, and for those who are negotiating, this might have also come as a surprise after these high-ranking officials met in Paris the first time, where the US administration also met with other European officials from France. The French government hosted this. Also German officials were there, and we've heard this criticism over and over from the European side that they feel sidelined, that they have not been included earlier. And President Trump likes to portray himself and also this administration as a deal maker, so that's primary to actually have a deal on the war, on the mineral deal that might or might not happen next week. So it seems the primary thing is to have a deal, and then secondary is at which cost, at which who would actually pay for a deal, or what are the conditions. And if it means that the US wants to increase pressure, we just heard it there from our colleague in Keith, that this might actually also just be strategic to increase pressure on both sides, on Russia and on Ukraine, to find a deal in the next couple of days. But also President Trump was quite vague when he said Marco is right, but did not say how many days this would actually continue on until the US kind of pulls the plug, if it's financially or if it's also military support for Ukraine.
And Ben, would the US moving away from Ukraine negotiations necessarily mean moving away from Russia as well? Would it necessarily be Russia who pays a cost in this?
It's quite hard because the negotiations that the US is having with Russia, we had Steve Witkoff, one of the most important advisors to President Trump. He met President Putin several times. So there are these negotiations going on the sidelines there. It's not quite clear what is offering or what are the concessions that they actually want to have from the Russians. But that's a way that Washington has been framing this, that too many people have been killed from the side of Russia, but also from the side of Ukraine, that they want this war to stop. But this is really the reality check of saying that many of those claims that he repeated over and over again, that this would be easy to end this war, that he would do these in 24 hours, and seeing as the second Trump presidency is nearing 100 days in office, that they went from ending this war in 24 hours to have the top diplomat of the Trump administration saying that they might even pull out or move away if there's not an agreement in the next couple of days. So it's quite remarkable also seeing that shift from the Trump administration, as they see that it was not as easy as some actually portrayed it.
And Nimisha, clearly this is not the first time the Trump administration has waved threats at Ukraine. What is the latest on the minerals deal that President Zelensky almost signed before that explosive White House meeting a couple of months ago?
Well, Phil, a lot has happened since that infamous standoff at the end of February in the Oval Office. We do know that technical talks have been ongoing. They resumed shortly after, and they have taken place over the last month. We also had leaked drafts come out, and there were concerns that the terms for Kyiv were very unfavorable compared to what was agreed on earlier. But now we do have something more concrete. Just yesterday, Ukraine's economy minister and her American counterpart signed a memorandum of intent for an economic partnership and a reconstruction investment fund. That was the title of it. And no mention, interestingly, of any minerals or any fossil fuels within that. But just to outline three key things within that memorandum for you, it said that the American people want to invest alongside with the Ukrainian people in a free, secure and sovereign Ukraine, that America stands by a just and lasting peace in Ukraine and appreciates its intention, secondly, of being a part of the European Union in the future. Now, this was a concern that had also come up in the last weeks, that a deal between the US and Ukraine may stand in the way of Ukraine's accession to the EU, but this memorandum outlines that America does appreciate and recognize that. And lastly, it sets out a timeline for the next steps. Now, next Monday already, Ukraine's Prime Minister is supposed to be headed to Washington to work out the final technical details. And then on the 26th of April, they want to be able to close out any final details, and the Parliament of Ukraine will have to ratify any final agreement, as would the US.
And Seema, J.D. Vance, the Vice President, he's there in Rome with his family. So this is clearly not purely a business trip.
Exactly. I mean, he brought his entire family, his wife and his 3 children. And it's important to note that he became a Catholic only in 2019. So he's a fairly recent Catholic convert. This is clearly a personal trip to come here to Italy, to the Vatican, at this solemn period for the Catholic Church in the Easter commemorations. He took part this evening at a Catholic service for Good Friday at St. Peter's Basilica. He was there together with the Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, whom he met earlier in the day. And on Saturday, he is expected to meet with Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Vatican's number 2, the Secretary of State, where they will be discussing a lot of issues, including probably international issues like the situation in Ukraine. The Vatican is very keen to promote the idea of peace there. So it's expected that they will be discussing that as well. Now, Mr. Vance has clashed with the Pope specifically in the past, particularly over the Trump administration's policy on immigration. Mr. Vance citing an ancient text as a Catholic text as a possible justification for the Trump's policy on migration. Pope Francis, in an unusual move before his hospitalization, wrote a letter to the U.S. Catholic bishops saying that this interpretation he rejected it essentially. He didn't mention Vance in particular, but clearly it was in response to that. So for the moment, we know that Mr. Vance will be meeting with the Vatican number 2. There is speculation, is he going to be meeting with the convalescing Pope, Pope Francis, still supposed to be under rest and recuperation, but we have seen him fairly active in the last couple of weeks. So there is some speculation, could they meet? And would this be a potential photo opportunity for the U.S. Vice President? That remains to be seen. But for the moment, we do know he's meeting with Cardinal Parolin on Saturday.
OK, thanks for that, Seema. Seema Gupta in Rome, Nimisha Jaiswal in Kyiv, Benjamin Alvarez Gruber in Washington. Thanks all. Well, Torrey Taussig is director of the Transatlantic Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Centre for Strategy and Security. I asked her if the Trump administration is likely to get tougher on Russia if it decides to abandon its efforts to end the war.
So there is a world in which this administration decides it is tired of waiting for Putin to come to the table. It is tired of Russia's continuous violations of the ceasefire and the conditions that Russia is putting in place for a full ceasefire, and decides to enact additional sanctions and costs on Russia. That is still certainly a possibility. There is another possibility in which the United States decides, sort of in line with what Secretary Rubio indicated, that this is not the United States war, that the administration has made an effort, and that they are walking away. And that could have dire consequences for Ukraine if this administration decides that it is done providing assistance, both intelligence and military, to Ukraine moving forward.
Can I give you a simplistic view of the Trump White House approach to international affairs and ask you to critique it? It goes like this. See a problem, spot an opportunity for profit or self-aggrandizement, overpromise, discover the complex problem doesn't respond to shouting and force, change your mind, lose interest. Pick that apart for me.
When you outline that position, I think most recently of the tariff negotiations, where it did really seem that this administration created a crisis kind of to its own detriment and then attempted to put forward a solution, which was really just leaving the entire global economy in a worse place. On this particular situation, I do think that this administration is looking for a way to end the war. I do not think that this means that it will end well for Ukraine. I do still think there are, as I mentioned earlier, possible scenarios in which this administration chooses to enact greater costs on Russia. That is not out of the question. But it is also not out of the question that this administration decides it has spent enough money and enough time on this war and decides to pull back assistance for Ukraine. Now, that would serve as a fundamental shift in America's approach to this war over the last 3 years. The United States, Europeans have said continuously, we will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. To hear Secretary Rubio say, we will address this war for a few more days and then we're done, is a fundamental shift in U.S. policy toward Ukraine. So I am still hopeful that the administration is getting tired with President Putin's excuses and violations of ceasefire negotiations to date. But it also could mean that this administration is taking a step back from supporting Ukraine as well. And that would, of course, put Ukraine in a dire situation.
That's very clear. Thank you so much for joining us, Torrey Taussig from the Atlantic Council.
Thank you for having me.